The wicked sisters who forced their brother in bed and got pregnant by him? That's what the bloodstained confession said. 1893. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a young man stumbled into a church, his hands dripping red, whispering of murder and biblical justice. But before anyone could understand, Silas Messer vanished back into the wilderness. What they found next would haunt an entire town. Bodies arranged like twisted sermons, a farmhouse hiding unspeakable secrets, and two sisters who smiled while their community looked the other way. Elizabeth and Agnes Messer had turned their own home into a house of horrors with their brother as both victim and weapon. The townspeople knew. The sheriff refused to act, and one detective wouldn't stop digging, even when the truth threatened to destroy everything. But here's what no one expected. How many children were born in that house of sin? And what happened to the ones who didn't survive? The autumn wind cut through the Appalachian hollows like a blade, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and something else, something that made the few souls still awake in the settlement of Cedar Knoll pull their shutters tight and whisper prayers into the darkness. It was the kind of night when the mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. The door of the small Methodist church burst open with a violence that sent the traveling preacher scrambling backward from his makeshift altar. Brother Samuel had been preparing his sermon for the morning service, his worn Bible spread open beneath the flickering candlelight. When the figure staggered across the threshold, the man's clothes were torn and mud-stained, his hair wild with brambles. But it was the blood that made the preacher's throat close with fear. Dark stains covered the stranger's hands and shirt front, still wet enough to glisten in the candlelight. "Forgive me, Father," the man gasped, though Brother Samuel was no Catholic priest, and this was no confessional. The stranger collapsed to his knees before the simple wooden cross, his entire body trembling like a man with fever. "I have done the Lord's work. But my hands are stained with the blood of the wicked." Brother Samuel had ministered. Two mountain folk for near on 20 years had heard confessions of bootlegging and feuding and worse. But something in this man's voice made his skin crawl. The stranger's eyes held a peculiar light, the kind he'd seen in those touched by divine madness or consumed by guilt so deep it had fractured their very souls. "Son, what is your name?" the preacher asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Silas," came the reply, and the name seemed to hang in the air like an accusation. "Silas Messer. I have been chosen, brother. Chosen to cleanse the filth from this world, to silence the whispers that torment the righteous." His words came in ragged bursts, like a man speaking through pain. The trapper, he hurt those who could not defend themselves, beat his woman, terrorized his children. "The Lord spoke to me in dreams, showed me what I must do." The preacher's blood ran cold. Thomas Whitmore, the trapper who lived 3 ridges over, had been missing for 2 days. His wife had come looking for him, fear and hope warring in her weathered face. Now Brother Samuel understood why the woman had seemed more relieved than worried. "Silas, listen to me," the preacher said, moving carefully toward the trembling man. "Whatever you've done, whatever you think the Lord has asked of you." But Silas was already rising to his feet, backing toward the door with the desperate movements of a cornered animal. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking. "None of you understand. They made me. They twisted everything holy, everything pure, but I can make it right. I can make them all pay for what they've done." He looked down at his blood-stained hands with something that might have been wonder or horror. "The bird remembers. The little carved bird remembers when I was good." Before Brother Samuel could speak another word, Silas Messer turned and fled into the night, leaving only the echo of his footsteps and the lingering scent of blood and madness. 20 miles away, in a cabin that clung to the mountainside like a growth on the living rock, Jedediah Stone jerked awake from dreams that tasted of smoke and failure. The former Pinkerton detective had come to these mountains to forget, to lose himself in the endless cycle of seasons and solitude that the wilderness offered. But even here, even in this place where the nearest neighbor was a day's ride away, the ghosts of his past refused to let him rest. He lit a candle with practiced movements, his hands steady despite the tremor that had awakened him. At 42, Jedediah had seen enough evil to last several lifetimes, had tracked killers through the worst slums of Chicago and Philadelphia. The badge was long gone, traded for the peace of anonymity and the promise that he would never again have to stand over the body of someone he had failed to save. The knock at his door came near dawn, soft but insistent. Martha Goodloe stood on his threshold, her gray hair bound back beneath a faded bonnet, her weathered hands clutching a basket that smelled of fresh bread and anxiety. "Morning, Jedediah," she said, though her voice carried none of its usual warmth. Martha served as midwife and healer for the scattered families of these hills. A woman whose knowledge of birthing and dying made her something between saint and witch in the eyes of the mountain folk. "Martha," he stepped aside to let her enter. Noting the tension in her movements, the way her eyes kept darting toward the windows as if she expected to see something terrible looking back. "What brings you up the mountain so early?" "Bad news travels fast in these parts," she said, settling her considerable bulk into the chair by his fireplace. "Thomas Whitmore has been found dead, murdered, in a way that she shuddered, her voice trailing off." Jedediah felt something cold settle in his chest, a familiar weight he had hoped never to carry again. "How bad?" "Sheriff Brody's calling it a dispute over trapping territory. But I've seen what animals do to men, Jedediah." This wasn't animals. Martha's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Someone arranged him like a sacrifice, all ritual-like. Cut symbols into the trees around the body, and there's talk of Silas Messer confessing to Brother Samuel before disappearing into the hills." The name meant nothing to Jedediah, but the way Martha spoke it suggested it should. "The Messer's old family, been in these mountains since before the war, live in a holler about 15 miles south in a house that's been falling down for decades. 3 of them left. Silas and his 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Agnes. Keep to themselves mostly, though, folks say." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Folks say there's something unnatural about that family, something wrong in the blood." Jedediah wanted to tell her he wasn't interested, that he had left that life behind for good. But even as the words formed in his mind, he could feel the old instincts stirring, the need to understand, to uncover the truth that others were content to leave buried. Murder was murder, no matter how remote the mountains or how strange the family involved. Where did they find the body? He heard himself ask, and Martha's knowing smile told him she had expected nothing less. The trap had been set, and Jedediah Stone, despite all his promises to himself, was already walking into it. The scene that greeted Jedediah at Thomas Whitmore's final resting place would haunt him for years to come. Sheriff Brody had already removed the body, but the arrangement of stones, the carved symbols gouged deep into the bark of surrounding oaks, and the lingering sense of ritualistic purpose spoke to something far more disturbing than a simple mountain feud. The killer had taken time with his work, had planned each element with the methodical precision of someone delivering a message to an audience he knew would eventually arrive. "Dispute over trapping territory? My ass," Jedediah muttered. Crouching beside a pattern of rocks that formed what might have been a cross or, perhaps something older, something that predated Christianity in these hills. The symbols carved into the trees were crude but deliberate, slashes that formed shapes his detective's mind recognized from cases involving ritual killings and religious mania. Someone had wanted Thomas Whitmore's death to mean something beyond the simple ending of a life. Sheriff Walter Brody stood 20 feet away, his considerable bulk draped in a uniform that had seen better decades, his face wearing the expression of a man who had already made up his mind, found the continuing investigation to be an unwelcome intrusion. "You see what you want to see, Stone?" he called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man unaccustomed to being questioned. Thomas had enemies, trappers always do. Someone got the drop on him, and now they're long gone into the deep mountains, where we'll never find them. In the arrangement of the body, symbols. Jedediah gestured toward the carved trees, but Brody was already turning away. Mountain folk got their own ways of doing things. Always have. Best to leave sleeping dogs lie, especially when those dogs got nothing to do with decent people trying to live their lives in peace. The sheriff's tone carried a finality that suggested the conversation was over. But Jedediah had spent too many years reading between the lines of official indifference to be deterred by bluster and badge-wearing authority. 3 miles south, in a cabin that reeked of unwashed bodies and something sweeter and more disturbing, Silas Messer sat by his window watching the path that led to Jacob Morrison's homestead. Morrison was a man who beat his wife with the same regularity that other men tended their livestock or brute whose idea of discipline had left. Mary Morrison, with broken ribs and a permanent limp, the community knew, just as they knew about most things that happened in these close-knit hollows. But knowledge and action were different creatures entirely in the Appalachian Mountains. Silas's fingers traced the outline of a small wooden bird he carried in his pocket, a carving he had made years ago when the world still held the possibility of innocence. The memory of creating it came in fragments now. Like sunlight through broken glass, his child's hands working the soft pine. The satisfaction of making something beautiful. The brief moment when he had believed he might grow up to be someone other than what his sisters were shaping him to become. Planning another sermon, brother? Elizabeth's voice cut through his reverie like a blade through silk. She stood in the doorway, her tall frame casting a shadow that seemed to reach across the room toward him. At 28, she possessed the kind of austere beauty that made men think of biblical temptresses. But her eyes held depths that spoke of appetites no scripture could satisfy. The Lord's work, Silas replied without turning from the window. His voice carried the flat affect of someone whose emotions had been carved away piece by piece, leaving only the machinery of purpose behind. Jacob Morrison hurts those who cannot defend themselves. The innocent cry out for justice. Agnes appeared beside her sister, softer in appearance, but carrying the same predatory awareness in her movements. "And what makes you think you're the one to provide it?" she asked, though her tones suggested amusement rather than genuine curiosity. "What makes you think you're worthy of being anyone's instrument of justice?" The question hit its intended target, and Silas felt the familiar wave of shame and rage wash through him. They knew exactly how to twist the knife, how to remind him of his weakness, his complicity, the way he had submitted to their demands night after night in the darkness of their shared home. But the shame was different, not transformed by violence into something sharp and purposeful. "I know what I am," he said quietly. "But I also know what you are, and some scenes demand payment." Meanwhile, Yedadiah's investigation had taken him to the heart of Cedar Knoll, where the combination general store and post office served as the unofficial center of community gossip and carefully guarded secrets. The proprietor, a thin man named Ezra Collins, greeted him with the kind of forced politeness reserved for unwelcome strangers asking uncomfortable questions. "The Messer family," Collins repeated, his hands suddenly busy rearranging items behind the counter that needed no rearranging. "Can't say I know much about them. Keep to themselves mostly. Come into town maybe once a month for supplies, pay in cash, and leave without much conversation." But Yedadiah had learned long ago to read the spaces between words. To hear the things people didn't say as clearly as the things they did. Must be hard living so isolated. 3 adults in one house, no other family around. Well, that's their business, isn't it? Collins's voice carried a sharpness that suggested the conversation was straying into dangerous territory. "Folks around here mind their own affairs. Always have." The door chimed as Martha Goodloe entered. Her timing so perfect that Yedadiah suspected she had been waiting outside for the right moment to join the conversation. "Evening, Ezra," she said cheerfully, though her eyes remained fixed on Yedadiah, still pestering folks with questions about things that don't concern you. Murder concerns everyone, Martha, especially when it's done with this level of planning and ritual. Her expression grew serious, the mask of mountain politeness slipping to reveal something more complex underneath. "Walk with me, Yedadiah. There are things best discussed away from listening ears. Outside, is the autumn wind carrying their words away from curious neighbors." Martha's demeanor shifted entirely. "You're stirring up something that's been buried for good reason," she said. "The Messer family, there are stories, old stories, things that go back generations." "What kind of stories?" Martha glanced around nervously before answering. "The kind that involve bloodlines that shouldn't be mixed, children born wrong, practices that ain't quite witchcraft, but ain't quite Christian either." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "I delivered babies for 3 counties over the past 30 years. Yedadiah, I know when a family's blood runs clean and when it doesn't. The Messers, their blood's been running poison for longer than anyone wants to." Remember, the pieces began to form a picture in Yedadiah's mind, though it was one he hoped he was wrong about. "How long has this been going on?" "Long enough that folks have learned not to ask questions. Long enough that even the law turns a blind eye when it comes to that particular holler." Martha's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But if Silas is truly killing people, if he's finally broken free of whatever hold those sisters have over him, well, that changes things. That forces folks to look at truths they've been avoiding for decades." As if summoned by their conversation, a scream echoed across the valley, high and desperate, and cut short with a finality that made both of them freeze in their tracks. Somewhere in the darkness, Jacob Morrison had just discovered that the mountains had finally decided to balance their books. Jacob Morrison's body was discovered at dawn by his own wife Mary, who had ventured out to the woodshed expecting to find her husband sleeping off another bout of drinking. Instead, she found a scene that would send her screaming across 3 ridges before her voice finally gave out entirely. The arrangement was more elaborate this time, more deliberate in its symbolic cruelty. Morrison had been positioned as if in prayer, his hands folded over a small wooden bird that had been carved with a kind of careful attention. It spoke of love rather than hatred. Sheriff Brody arrived before Jedediah, his face already set in the grim lines of a man who had decided that enough was enough. "Sends now, Stone," he said, without preamble as Jedediah approached the scene. "Whatever game you think you're playing, whatever ghosts from your past you're trying to exorcise in my county, it stops today. I'm not playing any games, Sheriff. I'm trying to solve 2 murders before there's a third." Jedediah studied the positioning of Morrison's body. Noting the increased brutality, the way the killer had taken time to inflict suffering before delivering the final blow, this wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about rage, about pain so deep it had transformed into something monstrous. You're stirring up trouble is what you're doing. Getting people all worked up, asking questions that don't need asking. Brody stepped between Jedediah and the body, his hand resting meaningfully on his sidearm. Mary Morrison S. got enough to deal with without some washed-up city detective making her husband S. death into some kind of circus. Thomas Whitmore, too, for that matter. But Jedediah's attention had fixed on the carved bird, its intricate details visible even from several feet away. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind of work that required not just skill, but genuine artistic vision. This wasn't a hastily carved message. This was something precious, something meaningful, left behind by a killer who wanted to be understood rather than simply feared. "Have you ever seen carving like this before?" he asked. But Brody was already turning away. "Pack your things, Stone. Be out of my county by sundown, or I'll find a reason to arrest you for interference with a criminal investigation." The sheriff's voice carried the finality of absolute authority. But Jedediah had faced down corrupt officials before, had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of small-town politics where justice often took a back seat to keeping the peace. The hostility that greeted him in town that afternoon was palpable. Wall of suspicious glances and whispered conversations that died abruptly whenever he approached. Ezra Collins refused to serve him at the general store. Brother Samuel crossed the street rather than acknowledge his presence. Word had spread quickly that the outsider was causing trouble, asking the wrong questions about the wrong people. And the community had closed ranks with the efficiency of an organism protecting itself from infection. It was Agnes Messer who found him as he sat on the steps of the abandoned schoolhouse, studying the carved bird by lamplight and trying to piece together the story it was meant to tell. She appeared out of the darkness like a wraith, her pale dress ghostly in the moonlight, her hands shaking so violently that she could barely speak. "You're the detective," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if expecting pursuit. "The one asking questions about our family?" Jedediah set the bird aside carefully, his every instinct screaming that this moment was crucial, that one wrong word could send her fleeing back into the protective darkness of her mountain holler. "I'm trying to understand what's happening here, trying to help. Help." Agnes laughed, and the sound held more despair than mirth. "No one can help us now. No one can undo what's been done." "What would I've?" Her voice broke entirely, and she collapsed onto the steps beside him, her composure cracking like ice in spring. The confession poured out of her in a torrent of words and tears. A litany of sins and secrets that painted a picture so horrifying that Jedediah found himself struggling to maintain his professional detachment. She spoke of years of abuse, of iron control over their household, of the way their brother had been broken and shaped into something monstrous. She spoke of children born in darkness and silence, of tiny graves hidden in the woods behind their farmhouse, of the terrible arithmetic of incest and its consequences. "We made him into this," she sobbed, her fingers clawing at her dress as if trying to tear away the guilt that clung to her like a second skin. "Elizabeth said it was natural, said the old families had always kept their blood pure, but I knew, God help me, I knew it was wrong. And I did it anyway because I was too weak to stop her, too frightened to say no." Agnes, you have to come forward. You have to tell Sheriff Brody what you've told me. It's the only way to stop this. The only way to help Silas before he kills again. But even as he spoke the words, Jedediah saw the hopelessness in her eyes, the bone-deep certainty that there was no redemption for sins this profound. Agnes shook her head slowly, already beginning to retreat back into the shadows from which she had emerged. "You don't understand," she whispered.
Elizabeth knows I'm here. She knows everything.
"By morning, the whole town will know I've betrayed the family, and they'll choose her word over mine, just like they always do. She's got them all convinced that we're the victims, that Silas is the monster. Everything else is just unfortunate family troubles that decent people don't discuss." The next morning brought news that spread through Cedar Knoll faster than wildfire in drought season. Agnes Messer had been found hanging from the rafters of her own barn, her suicide note, a rambling confession that Elizabeth tearfully dismissed as the ravings of a woman consumed by guilt over her inability to control her violent brother. Sheriff Brody accepted this explanation with visible relief, finally having a narrative that allowed him to close the books on the whole sordid affair. Standing beside Agnes's grave 3 days later, watching Elizabeth play the role of grieving sister with consummate skill, Jedediah felt the familiar weight of failure settling over him like a shroud. Yet the truth now understood the full scope of the horror that had festered in the Messer Holler for generations. But truth without witnesses was just another kind of lie. The community had chosen its version of events, had collectively decided that some secrets were too dangerous to acknowledge, even when those secrets continued to kill. As he walked away from the cemetery, Jedediah caught sight of Elizabeth watching him from across the graveyard. Her face a mask of serene sorrow that could unquite hide the triumph gleaming in her dark eyes. She had won this round, had successfully painted herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control. But her victory felt hollow to him. Somewhere in the mountains, Silas was still out there, still carrying his burden of rage and pain, still carving his bloody sermons into the bodies of those he deemed worthy of judgment. The scales of justice, Jedediah reflected bitterly, had never been more unbalanced, and he was beginning to wonder if they ever could be made right again. The silence that followed Agnes Messer's burial was different from the usual quiet that settled over the mountain communities during the long autumn evenings. This was a pregnant silence, heavy with unspoken questions and growing unease that seemed to seep from the very ground where her body lay. For the first time in decades, the people of Cedar Knoll found themselves unable to simply turn away from the darkness that had been festering. In their midst, unable to pretend that the comfortable lies they had told themselves were sufficient to keep the truth buried. Martha Goodloe was the first to break the collective spell of willful ignorance, her voice carrying across the general store with the authority of someone who had delivered half the babies in 3 counties and buried nearly as many of their parents. "Folks can say what they want about Agnes Messer," she announced to the assembled crowd of men, nursing their morning coffee and avoiding each other's eyes. "But I knew that girl since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, and she wasn't the type to take her own life over guilt. That girl was scared, bone-deep terrified of something. And it was on her brother's crimes that had her running through the darkness to find help." Ezra Collins shifted uncomfortably behind his counter, his hands busy with inventory that didn't need counting. "Martha, maybe it's best to let the dead rest in peace. Sheriff Brody's investigation is a joke, and we all know it." Martha's voice cut through his protest like a scythe through wheat. "Right. 2 men dead, arranged like some kind of twisted altar offerings. A young woman driven to suicide by forces none of us want to acknowledge. And all Walter can think to do is run the only person trying to find answers out of town on a rail." The gathered men exchanged glances that spoke of years of complicity, of truths acknowledged in whispers but never confronted in daylight. Old Samuel Pritchard, whose farm bordered the Messer property, cleared his throat nervously. "What are you saying, Martha? What is it you think we should be doing differently?" "I'm saying maybe it is time we stopped pretending that some secrets are too dangerous to drag into the light. I'm saying maybe the land itself is trying to tell us something, and we've been too stubborn or too frightened to listen." Martha's eyes swept across the assembled faces, reading the guilt and fear written in every weathered line and downcast gaze. "How many of you have heard the stories? How many of you know what has been happening in that holler for longer than anyone wants to remember? Deep in the mountains, 20 miles from the uncomfortable stirrings of conscience taking place in Cedar Knoll, Silas Messer sat beside a creek that ran cold and clear over stones worn smooth by countless seasons of runoff. Agnes's death had broken something fundamental inside him, had shattered the last fragile connection he maintained to the world of human feeling and empathy. For 3 days he had wandered these hills like a ghost, unable to eat, unable to sleep, tormented by the realization that his quest for justice had claimed the life of the one person in his family who had shown even the smallest spark of conscience. The wooden bird rested in his palm, its familiar weight a comfort and a curse. He could remember carving it during one of the brief interludes between his sisters. Nocturnal visits when the house fell quiet, and he could pretend for a few. Precious hours that he was just a normal boy with normal dreams. Now it felt like a relic from someone else's life. A memento of innocence so thoroughly destroyed that its very existence seemed like mockery. A rustling in the undergrowth brought his head up sharply, his hand moving instinctively to the hunting knife at his belt. But it was only a deer picking its way delicately to the water's edge. The animal regarded him with large liquid eyes that held no judgment, no horror, no recognition of the monster he had become. For a moment, man and beast existed in perfect understanding, two creatures shaped by forces beyond their control. Driven by needs they could barely comprehend. Miles away, Jedediah Stone stood in Martha Goodloe's kitchen. Studying a hand-drawn map she had sketched on brown paper with careful attention to detail, the old woman's fingers traced the winding path that led to the Messer holler, her voice low and urgent as she shared knowledge that had been passed down through generations of mountain women. "Agnes said something before she died," Martha whispered, glancing toward the windows as if expecting eavesdroppers. "Something about the crying room, about babies that never saw daylight. I didn't understand it, then thought it was just the ravings of a woman pushed beyond her limits. But now," she paused, her face grave. "There's a root cellar beneath their house. It's been there since the house was built, maybe longer.
Alzheimer's.
The old-timers used to whisper about it, about things that happened down there that shouldn't happen anywhere." Jedediah felt the familiar chill of recognition, the way seemingly disconnected pieces of evidence suddenly aligned to form a pattern too horrible to ignore. "You think that's where?" "I think that's where the real truth is buried. The truth that explains why Silas finally broke, why Agnes couldn't live with herself, why Elizabeth fights so hard to keep anyone from looking too close at their family business." Martha rolled up the map with hands that trembled slightly. "Getting down there won't be easy. Elizabeth's no fool, and she knows the walls are starting to close in. She'll be watching for anyone who gets too curious." The opportunity came 2 days later when word spread that Elizabeth had taken ill with what appeared to be a severe case of influenza. The timing was convenient enough to raise suspicions, but it provided the opening that Jedediah needed to approach the decaying farmhouse without being observed. He waited until well past midnight before making his way through the forest that surrounded the Messer property, guided by Martha. Careful directions in the pale light of a half-moon that cast everything in shades of silver and black. The house loomed before him like a cancerous growth, its sagging roofline and broken shutters, speaking of decades of neglect and decay. But it was the cellar entrance, half hidden beneath a tangle of brambles and rotting boards, that drew his attention. The lock was old but sturdy, designed to keep something in rather than keep intruders out. It took him nearly 20 minutes of careful work with his lockpicks before the mechanism finally yielded. The stench that rose from the opening nearly drove him back, a miasma of death and corruption that seemed to have been fermenting in the darkness for generations. His lamp revealed stone steps leading down into a chamber that had been carved from the living rock, its walls blackened with soot and stained with substances he didn't want to identify. But it was the collection of small wooden boxes arranged along one wall that made his blood run cold.
Oh.
Each one no larger than a shoebox, each one bearing a crude cross carved into its lid. The evidence was undeniable, overwhelming in its implications. This was where the children of incest had been brought to die, where the fruits of generations of abuse had been disposed of, with the same casual brutality that characterized every aspect of the Messer family's existence. As Jedediah counted the boxes, his hands shaking with rage and revulsion, he realized he was looking at a monument to suffering that stretched back decades, perhaps longer. When he finally emerged from that charnel house, gasping for clean air and trying to purge the images from his mind, Jedediah knew that the time for quiet investigation had passed. The evidence he had uncovered was too damning to ignore, too horrific to allow the community's conspiracy of silence to continue. Tomorrow he would return to Cedar Knoll with proof that even Sheriff Brody could undismiss truth so overwhelming that even the most reluctant witnesses would be forced to acknowledge what had been hidden in their midst for far too long. The photographs that Jedediah brought back from the Messer cellar spread through Cedar Knoll like wildfire, their stark black and white testimony impossible to dismiss or explain away. Even Sheriff Brody, confronted with evidence so damning that his usual bluster died in his throat, found himself forced to acknowledge what the community had spent decades pretending didn't exist. The small wooden boxes each won a tiny coffin for children who had never drawn breath in the light of day told, a story that no amount of willful blindness could obscure. Martha Goodloe stood before the hastily assembled town meeting, her weathered hands holding one of the photographs with the reverence of someone handling sacred relics. 37 boxes, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed schoolhouse. 37 children who never had a chance to live because we all decided it was easier to look the other way than to confront the evil festering in our midst. The silence that greeted her words was deafening, heavy with the weight of collective guilt and the terrible recognition that their complicity had enabled decades of horror. Old Samuel Pritchard rose from his seat in the back, his voice trembling with age and shame. "We knew," he said simply. "God help us. We all knew something wasn't right with that family. But we told ourselves it wasn't our business, that what happened behind closed doors was between them and the Almighty." Tears coursed down his weathered cheeks as he continued. How many children might have lived if just one of us had found the courage to speak up? How many lives could have been saved if we hadn't been so damn concerned with keeping the peace? The tide of community sentiment held back for so long by fear and willful ignorance, finally, broke with devastating force. Families who had whispered about the Messers in private now demanded action. Their voices raised in a chorus of outrage and self-recrimination that echoed through the mountains like thunder. Sheriff Brody, his authority crumbling in the face of overwhelming evidence and public fury, found himself with no choice but to issue a warrant for Elizabeth Messer's arrest. But Elizabeth had not survived decades of manipulation and control without developing a keen instinct for self-preservation. As the mob of angry townspeople made their way up the winding path to the Messer Holler, smoke was already beginning to rise from the windows of the decaying farmhouse. She had spent the day dousing every room with kerosene, methodically destroying evidence that could tie her to crimes spanning generations. If she could not maintain her carefully constructed facade of victimhood, she would ensure that the truth died with her and the house that had sheltered so many terrible secrets. The flames spread with supernatural speed, as if the very structure was eager to burn away the memories soaked into its rotting timbers. Elizabeth stood in the front yard, her face illuminated by the growing conflagration, a serene smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she watched decades of carefully hidden evidence turn to ash and smoke. She had one she believed had cheated justice one final time by destroying the physical proof of her family's sins. But she had not counted on Silas. He emerged from the forest like an avenging spirit, his clothes torn and his face gaunt from days of wandering the mountains in a haze of grief and self-recrimination. The sight of his childhood home engulfed in flames seemed to break through the fog of madness that had consumed him since Agnes's death, restoring a clarity of purpose that had been absent for weeks. This house, for all its horrors, contained the only evidence that might vindicate his sister's final confession, might prove that her death had not been in vain. Elizabeth, his voice cut through the roar of the flames, causing his sister to turn with an expression of surprise that quickly transformed into calculating malice. "Sweet brother," she called out, her voice honeyed despite the destruction raging behind her. "Come to watch the old place burn? Come to see the end of our family's shame?" But Silas was already moving, his body driven by an instinct deeper than conscious thought. He plunged through the collapsing doorway into the inferno, his clothes catching fire as he fought his way through smoke and falling timber toward the cellar entrance. Behind him, Elizabeth's triumphant laughter turned to screams of rage as she realized what he was attempting to do. The wooden boxes were already beginning to smolder when he reached them, their crude construction no match for the intense heat that filled the underground chamber. One by one he gathered them up, his hands blistering from the contact with burning wood, his lungs searing from the smoke that filled every breath. Each tiny coffin represented a life cut short, a victim of the family's depravity, and he would not let their memory be consumed by flames. When he emerged from the burning house, his arms full of smoking boxes and his clothes hanging in charred tatters, Elizabeth was waiting for him. The serene mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the monster that had lurked beneath her carefully maintained facade for decades. "You fool," she screamed, clawing at the boxes in his arms. "You've ruined everything, all of it. Everything I built, everything I protected." The townspeople arrived to find them struggling in the dirt before the blazing farmhouse, sister and brother locked in a final confrontation that seemed to embody all the rage and pain that had defined their twisted relationship. But instead of striking her down as everyone expected, Silas simply held her fast, his burned hands gripping her wrists as he stared into her eyes with something that might have been pity. "It's over, Elizabeth," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "No more secrets, no more lies. Let them see what we really are." The judgment of the community was swift and merciless. Faced with undeniable proof of crimes that spanned generations, they turned on Elizabeth with all the fury of people who had been made unwilling accomplices to evil. But there would be no trial, no formal process of justice. In a community where reputation meant everything, where social standing was more precious than life itself, the simple act of exposure was punishment enough. Elizabeth Messer would live, but she would live as a pariah-shunned and despised. Her name a curse word whispered in the darkness. Martha Goodloe took Silas in, her strong hands tending to his burns, while her wise eyes assessed the damage that went far deeper than scorched skin. He would never be whole, she knew would always carry the scars of what had been done to him. But there was still hope for healing, still the possibility of redemption through the simple act of living honestly in the light. Jedediah Stone left the mountains 3 days later, his faith in justice restored. It's not by the machinery of law, but by the simple courage of ordinary people finally choosing truth over comfortable lies. The Messer farmhouse continued to smolder for days, its blackened skeleton standing as a monument to the price of silence and the enduring power of secrets dragged into the light. As his wagon carried him away from Cedar Knoll, Jedediah looked back one final time at the scarred landscape, understanding that while perfect justice might remain an impossible dream, the fight to give voice to the silenced and bring accountability to the corrupt was a battle worth waging, no matter the personal cost.